I see some friendly names and faces and some new friends, so thank you for coming. And I think we have a pretty tight presentation this morning, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn to get us started.
All right, sounds like a plan. Thank you all for coming and for being here today. And welcome. We do have a quick, pretty tight timeline. I want to say that this is something that Emily and I have done several times. And usually we have a whole day in our face to face with our audience. So bear with us, help us figure this out because it's going to be a little different doing it this way online and with such a short amount of time. But Emily, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Um, with that said, as you read over today's goals, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. One, that this is hard work. This is hard work. It's not easy. Um, and so what this is an introduction, and that's truly all it can be with just an hour or so, hour and a half or so to be with you. So this is an introduction, but these are the things that we like to do today is to at least get you started thinking around equitable education about around equity in all phases, but particularly in education. And so again, just remember that it's hard work, that try to use active listening, hold on to your questions and we'll try to answer them. We have lots of resources that we're going to share at the end of the workshop through a live binder. So some of the things that we'll be talking about, you can access then. And just know that this is not the end. This is just a beginning. And, be prepared to be uncomfortable and be prepared for us not to have closure because we won't at the end of our time today. So, with that, let me do a quick just introduction of myself. My name is Evelyn Green. I'm the mother of two adult sons that you see there. This is at the youngest one's graduation a few years ago from Mizzou. I have been in early childhood. Well, I've been in education, and all 35 of those years have been in early childhood in one capacity or another, everything from a teacher assistant to what I'm doing now as an administrator. And I currently serve as the vice president of the Illinois department. I'm the Illinois Division for Early Childhood of CEC. So that's me.
Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Ropars. I work for Early Choices, but I'm doing this work today mostly as the current president of the Illinois Division for Early Childhood. I am the mom of three in a blended family, and two out of our three children have exceptional needs. So I come to you today as a parent and a professional. I've been in early childhood for 25 years now. Evelyn and I were joking, we have to keep, every time we do this, we have to add on some time because we were stuck saying we were in the field for 15 or 20 years for a while there, but time's passing. I've been in a variety of roles. I was fortunate to start my career in a lab preschool in Portland, Oregon that was inclusive. I was an assistant teacher there, and that sparked my love for inclusive education for all children. And I've been in a lot of different settings. So I'm very happy to be here today with you. So we always want to start these conversations with a little bit of ground rules and touching base with some good concepts. And because these words are used all the time and we're creating a space for this group to have this conversation today, we want to give you a chance to have some feedback for what you want to create today. So if you could find your chat by hovering your cursor at the bottom of your screen and let us know what the words safe space mean to you. So we can uphold that today while we're having our discussions about implicit bias and diversity. I'm going to open my chat. What does safe space mean to you today for this workshop? Okay, ability to talk and share with others without being judged. That's great.
Oh,
Another
I love
lots of non-judgment.
yeah. Positive intent. I love that.
Love it, Stephanie. Thank you. Natalia says open and honest communication. Yep. Place where you can open up. Yeah, ability to be honest and open without repercussions. We're going to be talking from the I, which means we'll talk about our own experiences today rather than talking about others, because this work is all about ourselves, truly. And then confidentiality. I think the general understanding of confidentiality is that what's shared within the space stays within the space. If that means something different to you, you can go ahead and put that in the chat as well. But for our intents today, we plan on being confidential. So if we bump into you socially or you guys bump into each other in another Zoom meeting today, what happens in this meeting is just for this meeting today. And then self-compassion. It's really important, as Evelyn said, this is hard work. And sometimes when we have these conversations, we might have memories of maybe experiences where we felt that we were discriminated against, or we might have a realization that we may have used words or actions that may have hurt others. And so we like to remind you that when you know better, you can do better. So have some self compassion. I would love to hear from any of you what self compassion means to you in the context of talking about bias. You can feel free to throw that in the chat as well. Oh, Talene, embracing your own vulnerability. Being honest with yourself, says Megan. Well, what Evelyn and I always find when we facilitate these conversations, there's so much wisdom in the room. And that's why we like opening up the chat, because we really want this to be a shared experience. Knowing that it is okay to have experiences that you are not proud of, but to learn from. Thank you for that, Stephanie. So, yeah, this is a journey. Evelyn and I are both on it too, even though we're here as the facilitators of this conversation. We also have to create a safe space and work with some self compassion too. So we're in it together. So let's go. The first thing we like to talk about is our social identities, because these are the filters that we see the world through. And I just need a thumbs up if this is large enough for you to be able to read it. You can use the reactions in the bottom, or you could put it in the chat. If you can see these words clearly, I would love to know if they're working for you.
It looks good on my screen.
Thank you, Marta. Okay. All right. So what we would like you to do is spend some time here. We are going to have some quiet moments here. It's not just going to be Evelyn and I talking. What we'd like you to do is to take a moment here and look at these identities and look at which column most of your identities come from. And maybe you go back and forth between the left and right side. But as we go through this, the column all the way on the left talks about the social identity they're referring to. The middle column is the groups that are defined as the norm and recipients of societal advantage or privilege. And then on the right are groups that are targets of institutional prejudice and discrimination. So I'm going to quiet myself for a few minutes here. I'm going to give you a chance to kind of look and read through these. Okay, I hope you've had a chance to at least look through most of these and kind of hold those in your mind. As we move forward, we're going to ask a few questions. You can feel free to answer in the chat. You can choose to turn your microphone on, or your microphone and camera. This is totally up to you. But after thinking about those different dimensions of identity and how some were in the privileged side and some were in the column about groups traditionally discriminated against, which of those identities do you think about most often? And again, you can feel free to go in the chat, or you can go ahead and turn your microphone on or camera. Marta says, being a woman, I feel like that is my primary identity that I move through the world with as well. And I'm sorry, AD Myers 1 says race is the primary identity that they think about most often. Dawn says sexual orientation. Talene is ethnicity. Age. Religious affiliation. So we're already seeing that in this group of 25 of us, we're all moving into the space that we came into today with an identity that we think about the most. And so now I'm going to switch it up to number 4. And the identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself. So which of the identities that we talk about did you have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? Megan says, my ability in spite of a disability. Love that.
That's great, Megan. And Stephanie says gender. And I just want to say that to give folks, because this one is a little more difficult. You have to think a little deeper with this one. So to give you an example, for me, I think of myself first. I say Black woman, but I think of race first, woman second. And part of that is because I know that's the way the rest of the world perceives me. The first thing that you see about me is my race. So it depends on your space and how you perceive yourself, but it's also going to be influenced a little bit about how through how you feel others might perceive you.
Right. And I know some of you might have read, and many of you have heard of the book White Fragility. And one of the early messages in that book is that if you grew up in the United States as a white person, race is not something that you most likely have thought about. And I think that is definitely, we're talking about the I today. In my experience, I never thought about my race until I was an adult. And part of that goes into the column of privilege, right? Because as Evelyn said, she thinks of herself as a Black woman because that's how you've experienced people experiencing you. And so just in that sense, as Evelyn and I are coming into the space together, we have that different experience about how we perceive ourselves. And then not real quickly, as long as it takes, identities that you think have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. And I'm going to say from my experience, that is heavily dependent on context. And I think that's true for everyone. In the early childhood world, I don't think being a woman and identifying as a woman has any impact on how people perceive me except in positive ways. Going to visit schools, going to early childhood programs. I think that being a woman makes me more readily accepted. And I've experienced that by visiting with males. There's a different feeling about being female, but in other senses, in other contexts, I think people would perceive different aspects of me. Stephanie says age, that you're young and you can help with technology. And I don't know if it's because of your age, but I do think of you as someone who can help me with technology, Stephanie, for sure. So Don says, age, you're always called my adopted kid's grandma when you're out. And Ari Vincent says, depends on the context with what group you're in. Okay, so then we want to add on another layer to this conversation about identity by talking about intersectionality. And Kimberly Crenshaw, and I apologize, I missed the accent over the E in her first name. She gave us this definition of intersectionality. It's the concept of having multiple overlapping identities that cannot be separated from one another, and that our experiences of oppression and or privilege are compounded by the combination of our identities. So the example that that we were given when we were talking about this was a Black woman may experience a combination of racism and sexism that's unique and separate from experiencing sexism as a white woman or racism as a Black man. So our overlapping identities heavily influence our experiences as we move through all the different contexts that we move as professionals and just in our personal lives as well. And so we're going to ask you to kind of hold the last three slides in your mind, thinking about how your social identities line up with privilege or disadvantage. And then the last conversation we had about how others perceive you, how you perceive yourself, and then layer on this intersectionality. And then let's talk a little bit here about what ways your social identities impact your relationships with colleagues and children and families, because we are the Council for Exceptional Children here. We're all professionals working in the field. So let's pause for a minute to think about how our social identities impact our relationships with our colleagues, our children, and families that we work with. And there are no right or wrong answers to this question. If you're someone who wants to just jot down notes to yourself in reflection, that's great. If you're someone who would like to share, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat or turn your microphone on. We're a fairly small group today. I can get us started here. Oh, Megan, thank you. The way you view yourself may differ from how others see you. That's right. So you may experience that difference in your interactions with other people. Stephanie says, I'm a talker, so I like to network both socially and professionally, which gets me into more work than sometimes I want to. That's true. I think one part of my identity that impacted my work greatly is when I became a mother. I think I changed the way I perceived myself as a professional, and I do think that that impacted my relationships with families. Bianca shares, I think when people find out where I live, it can change the interaction. Assumptions about my family, economic status, education, and gender role. Megan shares, depending on how well my colleagues know me, they think of me one way and underestimate me. Megan shares, underestimate me or my abilities rather. Okay. And I'm going to challenge us to think about specifically our interactions with children. That is an important part of our role as professionals in the field. So, how do our social identities impact our relationships with children? Denise says she's an introvert and you watch people. This does not make people feel comfortable. I'm with you, Denise. I love back before the pandemic, I love going to airports and sitting and watching people. It's like one of my favorite things to do. Imagine where they're going, where they're coming from. So let's think about this. So when I did the social identities, I'm going to go back so we can have them fresh in our memory. So when I do my social identities, I primarily fall on the privileged side of this chart. Almost 100%. And so in my interactions with children, how might that influence my interactions with them? Well, if I were someone who felt like my sexual orientation, which is heterosexual, was the norm, then maybe I wouldn't be as open to children who have expressed that they are not heterosexual. If I believe, I don't personally, but if I believed in the binary gender associations, how might that impact me with supporting a child who is experiencing an awareness of having some gender fluidity or as identifying as non-binary? So we have to really think about that we're coming into all of our interactions, not just with our colleagues and with parents, but with children, with all these elements of our identity that we're coming into. So Sophia shares that she thinks people accept me as a professional with skills in bilingual early childhood education. Stephanie says they might see you as an authoritarian figure more because that is what they experience more. I think that's true. I think when I've worked in schools where the children were primarily not white, when I was in a classroom, my teaching style was very different from what they experienced from their teachers who were teachers of color. And I think it really impacted greatly our interactions. Until they got to know me more and they realized I'm just a big dork. And then all kids like me after they realize how dorky I am. So as we continue going through, we want you to think about this. Denise says we must check our personal bias when working with children or adults. Right. And before we can check them, we have to be aware of them. And Denise, I need to send you $5 because that was the most perfect segue into what we're talking about next. So we have to recognize that we all have implicit biases. We do. It's not debatable. We all do. Some of them have positive connotations and some of them have negative connotations. Those implicit biases impact directly and indirectly how we interact with others, children, colleagues, families. And then acknowledging and examining our bias is the first step in changing our behavior. So we have to recognize these things. And I think sometimes people are uncomfortable thinking if you have implicit bias, that must mean that you're racist. But what we're talking about specifically, and it could mean that your implicit biases might be aligned with race, but all those different social identities that we talk about, we have positive or negative associations with them based on our own life experiences that might have been in our childhood that we're not completely cognizant of, but they impact how we interact with others. So I wanted to give you a chance in the chat to let me know what your understanding of implicit bias is. When you think about that definition, when you heard that we were doing a workshop today over lunchtime about implicit bias, what made you come? What do you think about? Letitia in the chat says that she can be rather outspoken too often, but I am very sincere. I think people judge me a certain way until with others as a white. Oh, I did two different things. I think people judge me a certain way until they get to know me. Stephanie says learning how to better talk about this touching topic with others as a white woman. Yeah. All right, so implicit bias, just so we are clear about our terms, are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So again, these aren't necessarily things that we're aware of. They could be something that makes us pull back or lean in to someone. They could be how we perceive someone's behavior. Denise says preconceived beliefs about others that are not based upon truths. Yeah. Don says sensitivity jumps out when communicating because of stereotypes. Yep. A.D. Meyer says, I think people accept me as a professional that comes with a helping spirit. That's wonderful. Stephanie says their reactions based on experiences. So yeah, these are, and they might not be experiences we remember. They may be how our family reacted when we traveled and interacted with people who were different from our community. Could be a lot of things, could have been things you heard in your places of worship. So the important part is to be aware when they bubble up. And because we're at a CEC conference, we want to just touch on this, that the Council for Exceptional Children issued this pledge, and we pledge to uphold the vision of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to support all of our members, volunteers, and staff, as well as the infants, toddlers, and students with exceptionalities and their families we serve, especially those differentially impacted by systemic racism. So as members of CEC and the Division of Early Childhood, this is our work. Getting to know what our biases are and identifying them and having these conversations, like Evelyn said, this is an opening conversation. We couldn't possibly, in an hour and 15 minutes, really get to everything, but it's a pledge that we all want to uphold because we have such a huge influence on how children and families experience our educational spaces. So I want to know from you, why does this matter as an educator? What aspects of our role as educators and professional development providers, administrators, why does it matter for us to do this work? Don shares, so we better handle how we deal with staff and students. Yep. All of our interactions with children are influenced by our assessments of them. Stephanie says to make sure we have equitable experiences for all children. And Talene says the way we show up with children can heavily influence their developing sense of self. If we could pin a comment, I would pin that one because as we're going to see, as I turn it over to Evelyn here, we have a huge impact on how children see themselves. Oops, I jumped ahead. I have a hidden animation here, but Denise says it matters because what we do or don't do impacts teaching and learning. Absolutely. So it's our actions and our lack of actions that impact how children experience school. So I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn, and she's going to kind of start digging down deeper into this idea.
All right. So, as Emily and I have both said several times, we are early childhood educators, but we know not everyone here is. However, we do come from that perspective, from an early childhood perspective. So a lot of what we're going to share with you in terms of statistics and the like may come from there. But what I want to say is that truly is the beginning of it all. And these next few slides will illustrate that. So I just want to start with saying that although African American girls are only, as you can see from this slide, they're only 20% of the female populations of the population in preschool, but they are suspended 54% of the time. Think about that for just a moment and think about what that stat implies about implicit biases, about how we think and react and feel with children who may not be from the same background that we are. What does that do to how we react to their behaviors? What we think they know? Emily, you can go ahead. And this is another way that this is impacted. Well, we know, and all of us know the rates when we talk about disproportionality. All of us in special ed know it, but becomes a little clearer when we put that anti-bias lens on it, when we put an equity lens on it, and look at it from that perspective. So if we already know that children in education and special ed are likely to have receive more in or out of school suspensions, we know that we have disproportionality in terms of race with children who are assigned to in special education. So what does that imply for things like discipline, for the number of times that a child is suspended? And one of the things that I do want to say is we are proud in Illinois to have, at least, I think I know across the board, but especially in early childhood, to have eliminated early childhood suspensions and expulsions just out of pocket for, without having a process to get there. And it's because of these very kind of statistics that we're looking at. If any of you are interested in more of this, it'll be in the resources. But Dr. William Gilliam has wonderful research. He's been doing this work for years, and has wonderful research about how this works. And one of the things that I want to say before we move on is it doesn't just apply to white teachers looking at Black or Latinx children. It applies across the board. Black teachers are just as likely to suspend or discipline more harshly children of color as white teachers are. So let's understand that. We all have biases that we need to get beyond if we really want to have equity in our school systems and in life. Okay, Emily, you can slide to the next one. All right, now I already just talked about disproportionality, but what we know is that that bias most definitely contributes to racial disproportionality. And it's not just racial bias, but it's also gender and class bias. So it's across the board. And that's why it's, again, important that we pay attention to the children and families in our care, and more importantly, that we pay attention to our own biases. I always say it's sort of like a 12-step program. We can't do anything about it until we acknowledge the problem and the issue. So understanding those things like proportionality, disproportionality, where it comes from, not just that we have it, but why do we have it, And understanding our own internal biases is what can make the difference in the lives of these children and families that we serve. Yes, Marta says it's a barrier which affects students who may need services and are not receiving what they need. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I almost jumped here before, but when we were talking before about what happens when those children get suspended more often. And as I said, it starts as young as preschool. Actually, here's a stat for you. Preschoolers are actually suspended and expelled more from schools than all other grades combined. Preschoolers. I can't imagine, but that's what the statistics tell us. So, one of the reasons that we worry about this is because once children are suspended, they're 10 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. They're much more likely to drop out of school, to become disengaged from the learning process, and likely to be suspended again and again and again. And this is, if you've ever heard the term school to prison pipeline or preschool to prison pipeline, this is where it originates. This is where it comes from, because we know that once we begin having harsher discipline on children, then they're going to have these bad outcomes. And again, we think about disproportionality. Which children are more likely to be disciplined, to be suspended, to be expelled? So again, this is where the bias comes in, and why we have to think about why we are reacting to children in a certain way. And that's why it's so important for educators. If no other group of folks on this earth get this and understand equity and anti-bias and these things, it needs to be us as teachers. It's our charge to really understand ourselves and our reactions to the students that in our care. So we just wanted to give a couple of examples. How many of you recall recently over the summer, there was a child in Michigan who was suspended because she didn't do her online homework during remote learning. And I'm sorry, she wasn't suspended, she was jailed. She was actually sent to juvenile detention. Now, pardon me, there was some other things going on, and she was a special ed student. But the fact is, would we have judged other children who may not be of color differently? Would we have looked at her a different way if she had been a white child instead of a black child? Would the judge have put her in jail? Would she have ever even been in the system to start with? So think about those reactions for a minute, and actually give us some. I'd like to see some reactions in the chat about your thoughts about this. And by the way, this article, we put the link in it, is from ProPublica, and they also did a follow-up article a few weeks ago with her. Actually, maybe a few days ago, where she kind of tells her own story that's very compelling. So if you're interested, you might want to take a look at that and look at it. I would agree, it is insane. and wow is a good response. My response was not quite as nice as wow. But yes, it's absolutely shocking that this is the kind of thing that we see. Can you well, stressful for the child, stressful for the entire family. Exactly, Martin, you're exactly right. And how do you know how to behave? And by the way, the child does have a disability. She has an IEP, so it's not as if we didn't know that the remote learning was going to be difficult. It's difficult for all our children, but we know, especially our kids with IEPs, it's difficult. So for those families and children. So just that reaction of that judge tells me a lot about her and her biases, and how they influence the work that she does. And is that somebody that we want having that kind of influence over our kids? I don't think so. Sort of just like with us as educators, it's important that we recognize that within ourselves. Emily, you can go to the next slide. So the second one, the second little story we want to tell you about, and we don't know if you've heard this one, is and think about how it affects how our own biases affect the children that we work with. You may recall a few weeks ago, a child was actually suspended because he had a gun in front of his e-learning that his teacher saw while they were doing remote learning. And she reported him. She reported the family. He was suspended. They reported him to the police. It was, I want to say, a Nerf gun. Whichever kind of gun it was obvious that it was not a real firearm, that it was a real weapon. It was obvious that it was a toy. And because he had it and was kind of, fiddling with it, and by the way, it was a child with ADHD and documented ADHD, and I believe he also had an IEP. And her reaction was to have him suspended, to call the police. And of course, I don't think I need to tell you that he was an African-American child. Is that the same reaction we might have had if that child was white? Just reflect on that for a moment. So these are just two very vivid examples of why it is so important that we recognize our biases, that we walk into the classroom with, and that we do everything we can to learn more and better. Yeah. Well, Marta says she couldn't tell the difference between a toy and a real gun. I'm sure she could. I'm sure she absolutely could, but it was an offense to her. Thank you, Emily, for straightening that out. It was a BB gun that a sibling tripped over. He just picked it up. So there we are. All right. Thank you, Emily, for clarifying. I couldn't remember all the details to the story.
So I just want to hop on that. We originally had this plan to be a round robin conversation, but we're not able to do that. So we really want to kind of dig deep into this because everything we've talked about so far leads to the kind of experiences that children are having, like we just shared. So we are going to ask folks to share with us, where do you see the racism showing up in these two stories? So the first story was a 15-year-old girl who has an IEP, missed schoolwork, and was put into juvenile detention because a judge determined she was breaking her parole. I believe she was on parole for stealing a cell phone, which she eventually gave back. The second story was about a 9-year-old boy, also with an identified disability, also a child of color, whose brother walked behind him, tripped over something. He picked it up and put it in his chair, and they wanted to expel him for school for having a gun on school property, even though he was at home in a Zoom room. Didn't ever touch it again, didn't hold it up, didn't point it at the camera. He literally just put it on a chair. So in those two stories, think about the disciplinary practices that were put into place and their school experiences, and where does racism show up?
And I see that Denise already, even before we asked for the reflection, noted that it all relates to school policies and procedures that are not equitable. You're absolutely right. That is the place. That's kind of the intersection of where our biases occur and what we can do about them to even the playing field to provide equity for all students. That doesn't mean that if those policies and procedures are in place, it's sort of like a firewall. It's a stopgap So it ensures that our biases do not unduly influence what happens to children. It's the reason why we in Illinois established those suspension and expulsion rules for preschoolers, because we saw that it was happening and clearly folks' biases were contributing to that. So we put in measures to help that to not happen.
Stephanie points out how many other children didn't complete the homework. It sounds like the teacher focused in on these children.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And if you're wondering, we're going to talk a little bit about action steps. If you're thinking about this and thinking about the context you work in right now, there are many resources out there. If you can't find them, you can reach Evelyn or myself and we'll point you in the right direction. There are tools you can use and facilitators you can hire to review your policies and procedures in your school with an equity lens. That could be an action step you can take, since the policies and procedures are reinforcing discrimination. That is a step you could take, is let's look at our policies and procedures. Where do we hold a bias towards the privileged column? Do we have expectations that are only achievable if we see it through the lens of one kind of being? And if that's so, that's what we can do about this. We can take the steps and do this work to examine our practices, but really those policies and procedures set the tone for the entire school building. So actually, Evelyn, oh wait, Stephanie has one more. Really, for the police, why did the charges even uphold with the BB gun when he was not on property? Just goes to show that the upper hand is given to the school and all was not equal. That is correct. That's
right.
That opened a whole can of worms that a judge closed back up, saying that wherever a school devices become school property, that's what the school was trying to assert, because he was using a school device, that the space around that device became school property and he was bringing a gun on school property, but that fortunately did not uphold at a higher court level. But there is another influencing factor, particularly when it comes to Black girls. So Evelyn, I'm going to let you introduce our video that we're going to be talking about next.
All right. So actually, I don't want to do much introduction because I think the video speaks for itself, and we'll have some reactions afterwards. But this is one of the most powerful tools, I think, that Emily and I use when we have these discussions, because it really brings home what we talk about when we talk about biases. So why don't you go ahead and push play, Emily?
In the United States, adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers starting as young as 5 years old. This is known as Adultification Bias. A groundbreaking study by Georgetown Law Center on poverty and inequality found that adults believe Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, less support, and less comforting. And related studies show that Black girls are punished at a disproportionate rate in schools and the juvenile justice system. These statistics reveal an alarming reality. But do they reflect the experiences of Black girls and women? We conducted focus groups across the country to hear about their lived experiences. They told us that Black girls often face higher standards.
I feel like you cannot make mistakes as a Black girl.
All kids make mistakes, but in similar situations, Black girls are treated differently. A white girl's mistakes might be met with sympathy and understanding. But time after time, Black girls are punished instead because they are held to a more adult standard of behavior.
Everybody says, oh, you should have known better. They're not even acting like we're children.
Those different standards may be linked to harsher treatment for Black girls. We heard stories about adults holding Black girls more accountable for their actions.
During a Foursquare game at school, one of the balls hit a girl in the face. They just my record. I had to transfer to a different school, but the other school didn't want to take me because I had assault and battery on my record.
In our focus groups, they overwhelmingly agreed that adultification bias is associated with punitive treatment. Negative stereotypes of Black women are also projected onto Black girls, which can contribute to adultification bias. Focus group participants overwhelmingly confirmed that even when they were young, adults viewed them as less innocent than their white peers.
There was this assumption that you're cussing people out, drinking, and having sex. But since I never thought about that before, they were basically introducing me to those topics right then. In 6th grade, the school nurse asked my aunt if I was sexually active. And I was like, at the time, like, what? Nobody has sex. Like, I didn't know anyone that has sex. She would never think to ask my white friend that.
Black women and girls also told us that adults stereotype them as too loud, aggressive, or angry, and see Black girls' actions as threatening and disrespectful. Adultification bias erases the distinction between childhood and adulthood, which can have a harmful impact on the lives of Black girls. We need to work together to end adultification bias. These findings in our new study provide key insights into the lived experiences of Black girls and an inspiration to drive change. We are committed to raising awareness and promoting the need for cultural competency training and age-appropriate treatment of Black girls so they can have a childhood in a safe, supportive, and nurturing environment where they can dream, lead, and thrive.
As Black girls, we still need to be protected. It doesn't matter if we're Black or not.
Be part of the change.
So, thoughts, feelings, reactions to that video on adultification of Black girls? How does it relate to the things that we've talked about in terms of, thinking in a equitable, thinking through an equity lens about our internal biases, about the implicit biases, the unconscious biases that we all have. Think about it in terms of some of the stats we talked about related to what happens to girls and children of color in terms of discipline in schools. And you can feel free to either take yourself off mute or to drop it in the chat. Agreed, Marta, absolutely agree. And here's something else that I'm going to ask you to do. And you don't have to share this. I'm not going to ask you to share unless you are comfortable doing so. Think about in your own practice, in your own teaching, when you may have done this, when you may have had that adultification bias against, Black or brown girls in your classroom. Exactly, Stephanie. Exactly. Another one of the resources we're going to share is a series of videos. And among them is a teacher who talks about how she might look at a Black child and with the very same behaviors very differently than a white child. She was talking specifically about boys and talked about how if it was a white child, she could visualize that child as being hers and would say things like boys will be boys. But with the Black child, for the exact same behavior, the reaction was, oh, we better keep an eye on him, or oh, here comes trouble. Yeah, Emily, the girl got an assault and battery charge for a Foursquare game on the playground. It's unbelievable. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with right here locally in Chicago, a security officer dragged, once again, a special needs student, literally dragged her down the stairs in high school. And as they, and he said all these things that he pushed her, she pushed him, and all these things, but there was video of it. And as it turned out, everything he said was a lie. But it goes back, and especially for her, for that issue, I think, of adultification. We don't realize that kids are kids when they're Black and brown sometimes. Yes, I can't see who put Andrea. Talene, you're just full of gems today, because I absolutely, one of the things that I worry and wonder about is the effect that it has on the other children in the setting when they see adultification happening to girls, or when they see harsher discipline happening to Black and brown children than their white counterparts. And when we talk about how our social identities are built from childhood, maybe not from experiences we had, but maybe from experiences we saw, from things that other people said. That's exactly what Emily was referring to early on in the presentation. Is, somebody seeing that, what is their attitude going to then be about a Black girl when they see somebody on the street or doing whatever? So. Okay, Emily, are we actually showing this one? Yes, I guess we are.
I think so. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about how young the adultification starts.
Yeah. All right.
You in timeout.
No, my bracelet came out.
I'll put it back on. You in timeout.
As no one
Don't say you supposed to be back in timeout. I didn't say get out. You and Jayla in timeout.
Well, let me tell you this, Linda.
My name ain't Linda. So you sit right there in timeout, little bad little girl.
No, let me tell you something.
No, don't tell me.
If I was in here, I would surely take a day off from you, and then a day off from these kids. I'm in the classroom. I'm just done with you.
I'm done with you too, but you in timeout.
Oh, let me tell you something, honey. This is not noise.
You're gonna be in timeout.
Oh.
That's why you in timeout right now.
I think so.
I think so.
Well, when I get up out of town and go to bed, I will be glad to go home and enjoy the rest of my life. And I could quit school because all of you.
You and
I just never even know what to say after I watch that video. But we do have a little activity we'd like you to do to plan and reflect. Think about looking at that video. Where did you see adultification in the video with the little girl? And again, think about your own experiences and reflect on your own experiences, and feel free to share if you'd like. You don't have to. We're not going to ask you to do it. But if you can think of something that you'd like to share, please feel free to do so. Exactly, Stephanie. The teacher was talking to her as if she was another adult. And again, I think this goes back to that point that, we want to make sure and make that bias is just not, it's not a phenomenon of white people. Or the majority in a location, in a community. It is a phenomenon that goes across the board, that we all have these biases, and most of them are, again, we don't have very much time today, but of course, all this is rooted from the very history of America specifically, and how it was founded, the use of slaves, all of that. So it goes back, but those biases occur within everyone, especially if we're not self-aware and understand that we have them. And we talk about her sounding like an adult. Clearly, that may be the way she's heard other people talk. And what do children do but imitate the adults around them? But that does not make them adults, because they're imitating what they see or hear. And so they should not be treated like adults because of that. We agree, A.D. Myers. We agree 100% that we do need real training around diversity, equity, and inclusion for teachers. There are just some fields where it is not even a question that we need to be doing this work seriously and, really putting a high priority on it. And I would certainly say education, the criminal justice system with judges and police, and folks who interact with Black and brown children every day, and Black and brown adults. There are certainly, that is certainly what we need to be doing. We need to all be taking this very seriously. I'm happy to say I see more and more of it within school districts. Just the fact that, we were asked to be here today is what we need to see. So. Yes, Stephanie, thank you for sharing that you recall. Stephanie said, totally recall teaching and thinking of a couple of children in my classroom that I classified as grown and did this without realizing the impact. And Emily agreed, especially when she was a instructional coach at the middle school level. And yes, I believe it's easier and easier to do the older the children are. But as you saw from that video, it starts in preschool. And yes, I'm certainly guilty of it. I can remember a couple of kids when I was a classroom teacher that I absolutely thought of them as older than they were, gave them some characteristics of an adult rather than a child, because of the way they spoke or things that they did. So absolutely. That again was just a reflection of what they were seeing and hearing at home. Yes, Marcia, you're right. There are some children who are made to take on responsibilities that they probably shouldn't have to take at their age. And you know, maybe take care of siblings, those kind of things. However, that still doesn't make them adults. And we still need to recognize that actually we need to be even more sensitive and careful with those children because they've even lost some of the opportunity to experience childhood in the way that we would hope that they can or that they could. And so, you know, because they have that responsibility doesn't mean that they should, or doesn't mean that we should treat them as if they're an adult. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are children who, just because of life's circumstances, have to take on adult responsibility sometimes when they're far from being adults. I don't know that we need to tone. That's a good question. I understand what your question is. And I have to think about that for a moment. I don't know that we need to tone down their adultness as much as when they're with us, give them the opportunity to be children. Because the truth is, if they are taking on those roles, it's because they have to. Because as you said, life is not going to let them, you know, be a kid at home or when they're not at school. So when they're with us, as much as we can give them opportunities to be children, as we cannot put those responsibilities on them or treat them as adults, I think is probably the most that we can do from our end. Although there might be more, and I'd love to hear what other suggestions. I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge and experience and ideas among you.
When I read that, Marta, I was thinking about this great talk I listened to from Shelley Moore. If you know her, she is.
I'm sorry, I could barely hear you for some reason.
Oh, Evelyn or me?
Yeah, I can barely hear you too. I'm not sure what's. Turn up your mic, maybe.
Yeah. Is it better now?
A little bit. You're still kind of far away, but talk a little louder and I think we'll be okay.
Okay. I was thinking about a great talk I heard from Shelley Moore, who is a great blogger. She's got tons of stuff on YouTube. She has an Instagram and YouTube series called 5 More Minutes. And she talks about the best thing we can offer children is to offer them a safe space in schools where they can self-identify, so that we create an environment in which a child feels safe enough to let down their walls a little bit and allow themselves to be their whole selves. So I bet, Marta, if you collaborated with maybe a social worker, or a school psychologist in your program, they might be able to help us think about ways that we can allow a student to transition from being at home into being at school. Maybe it's some kind of check in or check out, like, how are you doing today? All right, when you're at school today, you get to just be a student here, and we're here to support you, just to kind of make them aware that you see them, and give them that space to acknowledge that when they're at school, they can just be a student.
Yes, I mean, I do have this specific student for the past couple years, and she's always told me that her mom relies on her for everything. And now with remote learning, it's I'd say worse because sometimes she attends, and when I want to give her some small group attention, she leaves. She's probably attending to her siblings and helping her mom out. So I'm just trying to say, tone down their adultness, but allow them to be a kid, at least when they're with me in the classroom. But I think their minds are still going and they're thinking about things, that are going to happen at 3:00 once they're done with school. I'm just trying to bring her back down, and it's been a struggle. We're all struggling with the same student, in our school. So we're just trying to find different ways. And she does have a social worker. So I'm just trying to seek some outside help for this one particular student.
Yeah, I think that Emily is right. If you can work with that social worker and maybe come up with some specific plans or again check-ins, ideas, because the more you can reassure her that talk about, I think somebody said something about her leadership skills, but I think that the more that you can reassure her that she is a child, that you admire her ability to take on the responsibilities that she does at home, but just continually remind her that she doesn't have to take those on while she's at school. That's her opportunity to let those go. So we just got to notice we only have a few more minutes, 3 more minutes it looks like. So we need to start to wrap up. And as we said, this is clearly just the beginning of this journey. Clearly just the beginning, we're just starting. So we'd like you to think about where it is, where do you want to go further in your own growth and self-reflection around this topic and moving forward.
While you're thinking about that and typing it in the chat, I want to give you a chance. Oopsie, wrong direction. I want to give you a chance to screenshot our resources that we have available to you. We have a link to a self-assessment regarding implicit bias that Harvard has produced. You can go on that website and do a self-assessment. We've created a live binder of resources for exploring implicit bias. Again, you'll see a lot of things for preschool in there.
Little louder, Emily.
Oh, okay. I was going to say the live binder has a lot of resources. They will probably be pretty preschool heavy, but I think that you'd be able to apply a lot of it to your current work. There is a fabulous NACCE Diversity and Equity Facebook group. And again, NACCE is a organization for early childhood professionals, but it has fantastic resources in there. And then at the Illinois Division for Early Childhood, we're doing Facebook Real Chats. And you follow us on Facebook and you can join us at any time. We are talking about anti-racist work and looking at our board to make sure that our policies and practices reflect equitable opportunities for early childhood professionals.
Yeah. And you can always feel free to contact us if you have questions or are looking for resources and the like.
So as a closer, we would love for you to, you can turn your camera on and write a word down on a piece of paper and hold it up. You can put in a chat. We would love to hear one word about our time together. I love when people write it down and hold it up so we can see you. If that's not an option for what space you're in today, please put it in the chat. One word about our time together today.
Thank you, Kathy, for reminding us that we can get the information through January.
Stephanie says empowering.
Thanks, Stephanie.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of you.
Yeah. Empowering was the goal.
Celine says thought-provoking. We have enlightening, motivational, awareness.
Eye-opening, inspiring. All right.
Free to reach out anytime.
Yeah, I think you get our information. I think is in on the conference website.
I believe it is.
Thank you, Letitia. Thank you for being engaging.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thanks to everybody for participating. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, R.E. Vincent and Ria.